Once, there was a fellow known as One-Eyed Jack, and maybe you've heard stories about him, but if you haven't, what you need to know is that his right eye looked out bright blue into the world, but on the other side, where his eye should have been, was just a small hollow and a little flap of skin. He'd been born that way. And Jack's missing eye, it seemed to give him uncanny insights into the future, or where a lost object might be found, and you can imagine people were willing to pay for that kind of information. Of course, some people were afraid, and some people were both. So Jack would tell you he had his blue eye, just like yours or mine, and then he had this one that scared people. He called it his boo eye. And the boo eye had rules of its own, one of which was it worked better for other people than it did for Jack himself. Now, when this story takes place, Jack was a strapping youth, making his living working on the neighbors' farms, doing the kind of hard labor that strapping youth are suited for, bringing in the harvest or moving large animals around or rebuilding stone walls. And he worked hard 6 days a week, and he brought home most of what he made to his mama, and she was grateful and always made sure he had breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And on that seventh day, Jack liked to rest. He might go out in the meadow and watch the flowers grow or the clouds go overhead, or he might sit by the fire and lose himself in thought looking at the flames. Well, he'd been looking forward to a meadow day all week long, but when he woke that morning, he was haunted by the image from his dream, a little girl in a red cloak in a distant wood, some kind of danger. The dream didn't tell him any more, and neither did the boo-eye, except that Jack had some part to play in this story. He knew it was her story, but he had something he had to do. He just didn't know what yet. So Jack figured he was in for what he had come to think of as another miserable growth opportunity. Maybe you've had some of those yourself. You go through something awful and you come out on the other side with a little bit of wisdom. Jack hated those. He got up and he went to wash his face, and as he looked in the mirror, he asked the boo-eye again for some kind of hint. And his gaze fell on his mustache wax, so he waxed and twirled his mustache into two sharp points, and then his beard into three. It felt like a day for sharp things. And he went down the stairs to breakfast, and Mama had it all ready, and she had his lunch packed too. And she took one look at him, and she said, "Take the axe, Jack." You see, his boo-eye didn't come from nowhere. He said, "Mama, where do you think I'm going?" She said, "I think you're going to Mordry's wood." Well, that sounded right to Jack. He said, "What else do you know, Mama?" She said, "Not much, Jack, just a little girl in some kind of danger, and you should take the axe." And Jack looked over at that axe that he had just sharpened the night before, and well, that agreed with his mustache and his beard. And so when he was done with his breakfast and he'd kissed his mama goodbye, he put on his work gloves. He put that satchel with lunch over his shoulder, and then he picked up that axe. And as he walked that morning, with the sun at his back, he thought about how the boo-eye was both a blessing and a curse. And he wondered why Mama had told him to take the axe. Now, by the time he got around Mordry's town and to the wood, the sun was high overhead, so he stopped there at the edge of the wood and he ate some of his lunch. He kept some of it back because you never know when you're going into a wood who you might meet, who might do you a little favor if you had some food to share. So he only ate about half his lunch, and then he picked up that axe again and he started into the woods. And well, soon the boo-eye was showing him all the secrets of the trees and he was loving hearing all the stories that the trees had. And then he noticed some motion, something moving among the trunks, maybe 30, 40 yards off. Well, he finally got a good look, and he saw that it was a wolf. It was hungry and predatory. And Jack, well, he could put a wolf and a little girl in a story about danger together in his mind, but it wasn't much the kind of story he liked to listen to or to tell. And that wolf trotted on ahead, and, well, Jack hoped he'd have some warning if he was going to meet up with it. But then the trees, he was getting all excited about all the different trees, and he met this beautiful oak tree all in leaf. But as he came around that oak, there stood the wolf right in his path. So Jack stopped, and he said, "Good afternoon." Always paid to be polite, at least to start. But the wolf said, "What are you doing in my woods?" Well, I reckon we're both part of this story. You should leave. You should leave while you still can. Much too late for that. And the wolf, it raised its lip and showed a fang. And Jack, he twirled his mustache. And then the wolf closed one eye and looked right into Jack's blue-eye, and the hackles rose on the wolf's back and neck. And Jack felt an answering tingle in his own spine, and he saw a little further into the story. He didn't like to think what he was going to have to do with that axe. But he could tell that wolf was hungry, so he went to get some food, but moving that axe, the wolf startled and bolted, ran off, and was soon out of sight of Jack's blue eye. But the blue eye had gotten a good look, so Jack tracked that wolf through the woods until he heard voices, and then he stopped to listen, quiet-like. "Whoa, little girl, where are you going?" "Oh, I'm going to see my grandmother. She's been ill, and I'm bringing her bread and wine." "Oh, aren't you sweet? Does she live far?" "Oh, not too far. It's the house under the 3 oak trees with the nut trees just beneath. You must know it." "Oh, I think I do. And wouldn't a bouquet of flowers look lovely in her window? Why, you walk along as seriously as if you were going to school, but look about you. The birds are singing, the flowers are blooming, the woods are merry." And Jack felt the moment that that little girl turned and noticed the flowers for the first time, and the wolf trotted off. And Jack knew he was at the crux of his part in this story. He knew a story could unfold in so many different ways, and he didn't know whether it was better to go help the girl or chase the wolf. The blue-eye wasn't telling him anything. Finally, he went with his heart. He wanted to protect that little girl, so he went to the meadow where she was, and he stopped just inside the trees. He didn't want to scare her. And there she was, crouched in the flowers, her red cloak flung back, her white blouse shining in the sun, her face so intent on her task, and those round cheeks, just the kind Mama would want to give a pinch. And then Jack realized she was harvesting skullcap, and she had a basket full of it already, enough to put a whole family to sleep for a while, but she was using a little pair of scissors to cut those flowers. And they were just like the scissors Jack used when he did embroidery. Oh, you might laugh, a grown man like Jack doing embroidery, but he found making pictures out of the thread, well, it helped him sort out the images that the blue-eye was forever showing him. He wished he had a needle and thread right now. And then that little girl, she must have felt him looking at her. She turned and saw him standing there in the woods with his missing eye and his whiskers all awry and his axe held high, and she screamed. And she held up her scissors as if to defend herself, and then She just threw them in the basket with the flowers, grabbed the basket, and ran. And Jack, he couldn't move. He was speared to the spot by her fear. He hadn't meant for the story to go this way at all. He wished he'd been able to give that wolf some food. When he finally started walking, it felt like his legs were pushing through the strong current of a river. And then he heard the second scream and the sickening, muffled ending, and he ran full tilt for that house under the 3 oak trees, and when he got there, he could hear a snoring, and that was no grandmother. He went to the door. Oh, he hoped that breaking the latch would be what the axe was for, but no, he pushed the door open, and there was the terrible caricature of a grandmother on the bed, the cap pulled down over the wolf's ears, and that nightgown already torn over the distended belly. And Jack knew what he had to do with that axe. Well, he took off his gloves first. They'd be awfully hard to clean. And then he held that axe right beneath the blade, and he cut that wolf from sternum to crotch. And as he pulled the skin and muscle apart, he saw that distended stomach and that little pair of scissors as Little Red Cloak was cutting her way out. And when she saw him there, she fixed him with such a look. And they came to an understanding. She climbed out on her own, but she did allow Jack to help Grandmother out. Grandmother went to put some water on they could all get cleaned up, and then the little girl told Jack her plan. "We'll get some stones and we'll fill his belly, and then I'll sew him up the skullcap in there. I'll keep him asleep. I'll sew him up, and then he'll think he's still got us inside, and when we wake him, he'll leave the house forever." And Jack, he helped her carry the stones, and then she sewed that wolf up with quick basting stitches. They were neat and tidy, but just enough to get the job done. And when it was done, well, she and Grandmother, they got out the pots and pans, and they gave that wolf such a shivery that he woke and stumbled, still in a half stupor, out of the house and into the woods, just like Little Red Cloak had said. Well, out in the woods, the stitches gave way, and the wolf died there. And Jack knew what else he had to do with that axe. He skinned that wolf while the vultures gathered and the little girl watched. And they left the carcass there for the birds. And then, well, Jack took the axe and the wolfskin. He made sure Little Red Cloak and her grandmother got safely back to Mordry's town. And then he took those things home. Mama already put water on to boil before he got there. And when she saw him, she said, "How'd it go, Jack?" He said, "It ain't gone yet, Mama." So she didn't ask anything more. He cleaned the axe first, and as he dried the blade and set it in the corner, he said, "Mama, I'm sorry I'm always going to think on this story whenever I chop wood." She said, "I'm sorry too, Jack." And then Jack went and he cleaned and tanned that hide. And when it was ready, he sat down with his needle and thread, and he fashioned it into a fine cloak. And Mama didn't ask him any questions, but when he looked up, she'd catch his eye and give him a nod. And when it was all ready, he folded it up to go, and Mama got her cloak to go with him. And as they walked to Mordry's town, he said, "Mama, I think this cloak, I think it'll be a blessing and a curse. It'll keep her warm." "It will do that, Jack. It's finely made. But whenever she wears it, she's going to be thinking like a predator. She's always going to be looking for the next wolf to cross her path." "Yes, Jack, she will." And that little girl, she must have felt them thinking about her, 'cause she was waiting there at the edge of Mordry's town. She was wearing her red cloak, which had been cleaned, but it was badly stained. And Jack, he went up to her and he knelt and held out that wolfskin cloak. And she gave him another look. And then she untied that red cloak and let it fall to the ground. And she took that wolfskin cloak from him, and as the weight of it settled on her shoulders, she looked up at Mama, who gave her a nod. And then that little girl, she pulled the hood up over her head, and she leaned in close, and she gave Jack a kiss, right there on his cheekbone, right under his boo eye. And after that, well, no one called her Little Red Cloak after that. No, after that she was known as Wolfskin.